I'm Claire Henderson. I'm 33. I run my own strategy consultancy for Fortune 500 firms. And until 2 hours ago, my family thought I was just freelancing from coffee shops barely scraping by. It was our annual family barbecue, the one my mom plans like it's a suburban Met Gala with color-coordinated napkins and just enough rosy to loosen everyone's judgment. I had barely set my plate down when Uncle Dean asked if I was still doing that cute little online gig, and Mom laughed along, chiming in that I was the free spirit in the family, still figuring things out. My cousin Rachel asked if I'd considered going back to school, maybe getting a real degree this time. My brother Max, the family golden boy, fresh off his first promotion at a prestigious finance firm, smiled politely and said nothing. No one meant to be cruel. They just never asked what I actually did. And somewhere along the way, I stopped trying to tell them. I played along like I always did. Sat at the small table near the kids, spooned myself salad, and let the chatter wash over me like it didn't sting. It was easier to nod and smile than to explain global market research cycles, or why most of my meetings start at 6 a.m., because half my clients are in Europe. I'd grown used to being the background character at these gatherings, tolerated, but not quite taken seriously. Then came the moment. A sleek gray SUV pulled up to the driveway, and people started to shift. Max's shoulders straightened. Dad tucked in his polo. The man stepping out was Mr. Langford, the CEO of Max's firm, the CEO at our backyard barbecue. The buzz swept the patio as Mr. Langford crossed the lawn, polite smile in place but his eyes scanning. He walked past Max, past my parents, and stopped directly in front of me. "Claire, good to see you. I didn't expect to run into our new global lead here. The board's still talking about your Tokyo report. You saved us 6 months of legwork." And just like that, the air changed. Every fork paused mid-air. I met his gaze, calm and steady. "We'll follow up next week," I said. He nodded, then turned away, unaware he had just detonated a truth bomb in my family's world. For the first time, they saw me not as Max's underachieving sister, but as the strategist shaping his CEO's next global expansion. Being the middle child in my family felt like living in a shadow that never moved. My sister Emily was the overachiever, always top of her class, laser-focused on med school since she was 13. My younger brother Max was the charming one, the kid with the quick wit, the varsity jacket, and the easy smile that made teachers forgive late homework. And then there was I. Quiet, bookish, always scribbling in the margins of notebooks, designing logos for imaginary companies instead of studying for the SAT. I loved color theory more than calculus, and I once skipped a family trip to stay home and learn Photoshop. My parents didn't quite know what to make of that. At dinner, the spotlight always rotated between Emily's internships and Max's awards. When it landed on me, it was usually with a puzzled pause. "Claire's been doing some kind of design thing," Mom would say, her tone vague. "You know computers." Everyone would nod politely, then return to Max's college tour or Emily's hospital rounds. I learned early how to take up as little space as possible. I stopped trying to explain what UI meant or why typography mattered. It was like speaking a language they didn't want to understand. Stability was everything to them. A salary, a title, a pension plan. Creativity in their world was a hobby you outgrew. I remember the day I got my first freelance paycheck. I had built a brand identity for a boutique bakery, and they paid me with a handwritten check and 3 dozen cupcakes. I was proud, holding that paper like a trophy. My dad glanced at it and said it was cute, but maybe I should think about business school. When Emily got into Johns Hopkins, we threw a party. When Max was recruited for an investment firm before graduation, my parents took the whole family out for steak. When I launched my first website that hit 6 figures in traffic, no one noticed. I mentioned it once at brunch, and the conversation shifted to Max's new condo. Sometimes I wondered if they even knew what I did. I tried a few times to bridge the gap, to show them that design could be strategic, that my clients weren't just Etsy shops, but growing startups with real impact. But their eyes glazed over. Or worse, they nodded like they were indulging a child's phase, so I stopped. I got used to being the quiet one, the one who brought the fruit salad and left early. It was easier to let them believe I was harmless than to force them to see me differently. Easier to keep my success private than to watch it be dismissed in real time. And eventually, I didn't expect recognition. I just learned to live without it. I started my business from my apartment kitchen table with a second-hand laptop and a Wi-Fi connection that dropped every time it rained. My first client was a friend of a friend who needed a basic website for her home bakery. I charged $200 and spent 30 hours making it perfect because I knew if I didn't treat it seriously, no one else would. Every project that followed was a referral. I didn't have a marketing budget or a team, just a portfolio I built from scratch, and a quiet belief that design could solve real problems. I worked nights and weekends squeezing client calls between temp jobs, learning on the go, making mistakes, and fixing them myself because there was no one else to call. When I landed my first retainer contract, I cried. Not because of the money, though it helped, but because it meant someone trusted me with more than just a one-off task. It meant someone saw the value I was bringing, even if my own family never had. I mentioned the milestone at dinner once in passing, and my mom responded by asking if I'd considered applying for a job at Emily's hospital doing admin work. So I stopped sharing. When I landed my first corporate client, I celebrated alone with takeout sushi and a glass of cheap wine. When I hired my first contractor, I texted a college friend because I knew she'd get it. And when a mid-sized startup asked me to lead a full rebranding campaign, I didn't tell anyone in my family at all. It wasn't bitterness. Not exactly. It was more like self-preservation. Every time I'd tried to explain what I was building, the conversation got steered back to Max's new office view or Emily's latest surgical rotation. They couldn't see beyond job titles and benefits packages. They couldn't imagine that success might come in a form they didn't recognize. But I kept going. I read business books on my lunch breaks and taught myself contract negotiation late at night. I invested every dollar I made back into the company, bought better tools, paid my contractors on time, and never missed a deadline. My client base grew quietly but steadily from local shops to international startups, then to firms with marketing teams bigger than my entire business. Within 3 years, I was leading projects across 3 time zones. I had to schedule meetings at 5 a.m. and 10 p.m. just to make it work. I still worked from my apartment, still wore hoodies and no makeup, but I had a team of 7, a waitlist, and gross revenue that would have shocked my father if he'd ever asked. I kept receipts. Not the kind you brag about, but the kind that reminds you why you don't need to. I didn't build this to prove them wrong. I built it because I knew what I was capable of, and that was enough. Even if they never asked, even if they never cared, I knew. And that was what mattered. By the time I arrived at the Reynolds family barbecue that summer, the lawn was already full of people clinking glasses and pretending not to compare lives. The smell of grilled meat hung heavy in the air, along with the usual tension of performative success. I was handed a sparkling water, not by a cousin, but by a hired server, and told that seating had been arranged in advance. I found my name tag at the small, round table near the swing set, sandwiched between my 15-year-old niece and my uncle's 30-year-old son, who still lived in his parents' basement. Across the yard, my brother Max sat at the main table with my parents, a few lawyers, and someone from his firm's HR department. I wasn't surprised. It had become tradition to place me wherever I wouldn't interrupt the flow of praise being passed around like appetizers. My aunt leaned in during appetizers and asked if I was still doing that thing with the computers. I told her I ran a strategy consultancy, but her eyes glazed over before I could finish. She nodded vaguely, then launched into a story about Max's recent promotion and how he was now managing real assets. Real, as opposed to whatever it was I did. I smiled and said nothing. It wasn't worth the energy anymore. Across the table, someone asked if I was seeing anyone, and when I said no, they gave me that sympathetic tilt of the head that made me want to scream. Another cousin told me her friend was hiring at a printing shop, and maybe I should send a resume just in case. Every time I opened my mouth to contribute something real, someone changed the subject. I mentioned I had just wrapped a campaign for a tech firm expanding to Europe, and my mother responded by asking if Max's company had a European office. My words landed and slid off invisible before they even reached their ears. They weren't listening. They had already decided who I was and didn't care to revise the narrative. Later, while I helped arrange dessert trays, because that was something they could understand, I overheard someone say it was sweet that I still tried to come to these events. Like I was a distant cousin, they tolerated us out of tradition. I stood there holding a tray of cookies, listening to them praise Max's work ethic and Emily's latest publication in a medical journal, and I felt the same familiar ache spread through my chest. I didn't want applause. I didn't need validation. But I wanted them to see me. Not the version they kept in their heads, but the actual woman I'd become. And once again, they didn't. They never even looked. It started with the sound of gravel crunching in the driveway. Conversations paused for just a second as a sleek black car pulled up beside the Reynolds hedge-lined fence. Max stood up straighter, brushing invisible crumbs off his khakis, and my father casually stepped forward like a host preparing to greet someone important, but not too important. The man who stepped out of the car wore confidence like a tailored jacket. Relaxed, but sharp, perfectly at ease, like someone used to commanding boardrooms and entire weekends. Mr. Harlan, CEO of Beckridge Capital, Max's firm. The man everyone at this barbecue had heard about but never expected to meet in real life, let alone at a backyard event with plastic cups and folding chairs. People shifted, murmured, and glanced at Max with pride. My mother smoothed her blouse, then waved frantically toward my father, whispering something about drinks and hors d'oeuvres. Max looked like he'd been waiting for this moment his entire life. Then it happened. Mr. Harlan scanned the crowd, bypassing Max completely, and walked straight across the lawn toward me. He didn't hesitate, didn't second-guess, just smiled and extended his hand. "Claire, good to see you. I didn't expect to run into our new head of global strategy here. The London team couldn't stop talking about your rollout framework." The silence was instant and heavy. My cousin froze mid-bite. My aunt's wine glass hovered inches from her lips. Max blinked once, then again. My mom dropped the napkin she'd been folding into a swan. Every head turned toward me like they were seeing me for the very first time, and still weren't quite sure if it was a mistake. I shook his hand steady, even though my heart was hammering. "Good to see you too. We'll circle back next week." He nodded, gave a polite wave to no one in particular, then disappeared into the house to find my father. I stood there for a beat longer, letting it sink in, letting the weight of it hang where it needed to. My brother's CEO had just walked past everyone at the top table to talk business with the so-called unemployed cousin seated by the lemonade cooler. The woman no one thought was doing anything of value just got named as the architect of the firm's international growth. And in that moment, without a single raised voice or dramatic announcement, everything changed. Mr. Harlan's words were still echoing when my dad came back outside, trailed closely by my mom, who looked like she was trying to smile but couldn't quite remember how. The patio had gone silent again, except for the sound of the drink cooler humming by the fence. I stood still, letting the moment hold its weight, not rushing to fill it, not shrinking from it either. He asked me to join him and my father inside for a brief chat. My mom followed, hovering just behind, like she didn't want to miss whatever she clearly hadn't seen coming. In the living room, Mr. Harlan began explaining the scope of the partnership we were finalizing between Beckridge and my firm Clarion Strategies. He said it so plainly, so professionally, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. He talked about the global expansion model I'd built, the impact projections I presented to their executive board, and the pilot launches we were coordinating across Europe and Southeast Asia. He mentioned my leadership style, my calm under pressure, and how impressed the firm was with my vision. My parents sat on the edge of the couch, like they'd been dropped into a foreign film without subtitles. I kept my tone, even every word deliberate. I filled in the blanks when necessary, but didn't embellish, didn't gloat. I wasn't here to shock them. I wasn't here to make them feel small. I was just finally done pretending that their version of me was the truth. When we stepped back outside, the ripple effect had already spread. Cousins whispered. My aunt suddenly remembered that her neighbor needed branding help. Max stood awkwardly by the grill, jaw tight, avoiding my eyes. The people who once asked if I was still designing flyers were now asking about firm valuations and hiring timelines. My mother caught my arm gently and asked if I wanted to sit with them at the main table. Her voice was soft, like she wasn't sure how to approach me anymore. I nodded, not out of spite, but because I no longer needed the seat to prove anything. I had already built the table where decisions were made. Over lunch, my dad asked if I always knew it would work. I answered honestly, no. But I believed it was worth building anyway. He nodded slowly, then said he wished I'd told them sooner. I reminded him just as calmly that I had, many times. He just hadn't been listening. Max approached later, standing next to me with the same uncertainty I used to carry. He asked if I'd really been leading the firm's global rollout and whether our teams would cross paths. I told him it was possible. Depends on where he landed in the org chart. I smiled, not unkindly. He didn't quite smile back, but he didn't walk away either. That was enough. I didn't need apologies. I didn't need long explanations. What I needed was for them to look me in the eye and see who I really was. And that day, for the first time, they did. Not because I demanded it, not because I proved anything, but because the truth stood tall enough to be undeniable. 2 weeks after the barbecue, my parents asked if they could visit my office. The request came in the form of a carefully worded text from my mom, full of phrases like, "Whenever you're free, and only if it's not a bother." I told them Friday afternoon would work, and I spent the morning trying to decide whether to tidy up my desk or let it look the way it usually did, organized chaos. They arrived exactly on time. My dad wore a blazer and my mom brought cookies. They looked around the space with cautious curiosity, like they were touring a museum they didn't quite understand, but didn't want to offend. I showed them the project wall, the team call schedule, and the international time zone clocks. My dad asked about revenue models, and for once, not in a dismissive tone. He listened carefully. He nodded when I explained how we build custom strategies for each client, how we scale teams depending on campaign size, and how our firm had doubled in size in less than 18 months. My mom lingered near the framed press features on the wall. She didn't say much, but I noticed her reading the full paragraphs instead of just glancing at headlines. Max reached out the following week. He wanted to grab coffee, asked if I had time to talk about professional goals. We met at a cafe halfway between our offices, and for the first time, he didn't try to dominate the conversation. He asked about how I built client trust, how I handled imposter syndrome, how I knew when to grow the team. I gave him honest answers, not because I wanted to prove anything, but because he was asking for the right reasons. He wasn't comparing. He wasn't defending. He was learning. And that shift, however small, felt like a beginning. Things didn't change overnight. My mom still sometimes called my projects cute. My dad still asked questions with a finance-first lens. But there was less condescension, more effort. They sent me articles they thought I'd find useful. They introduced me differently at gatherings. Slowly, awkwardly, they were trying, and I was letting them. Not because I needed their approval, but because I still believed in connection, even the messy kind. I didn't forget the years of dismissal, but I wasn't holding them like weapons either. I was letting them become part of the story, not the whole of it. Healing, I realized, doesn't arrive with apologies or grand gestures. It creeps in through small actions, through showing up, listening better, and staying open to what's next. And for the first time in a long time, we were all doing just that. One quiet shift at a time. For a long time, being overlooked felt like a weight I couldn't shake. It made me question everything, not just my career choices, but my worth, my instincts, even my voice. When the people closest to you see through you, it becomes easy to wonder if there's anything there to see at all. But somewhere along the way, that silence turned into space. Space to build something real. Space to shape my path without their expectations breathing down my neck. I stopped waiting for applause and started paying attention to my own progress. I stopped asking for approval and started asking better questions. Being underestimated gave me freedom. It made me resilient. It taught me to listen deeply, to trust slowly, and to keep going even when the room stayed quiet. I didn't succeed in spite of being dismissed. I succeeded because I had to learn how to carry belief for myself when no one else would. Do I wish things had been different sometimes? But I also know that without that ache, I wouldn't have become the version of myself that could walk into any room and know what she brings to the table. Not loudly, not desperately, just fully. What I've learned is this: recognition doesn't make you worthy. Titles don't make you valid. The clearest measure of success is living in alignment with what you value even when no one is watching. Especially when no one is watching. If you're someone who's been overlooked, dismissed, or quietly underestimated, I hope you know that you're not alone. And more than that, I hope you realize the strength it takes to keep going anyway. Sometimes being unseen is what gives us the space to become exactly who we were meant to be. What about you? Has being underestimated ever become your greatest fuel? Share your story in the comments. You never know who needs to hear it.